Croatia's culture and heritage evolved over the centuries in 3 geographical regions, along the coast, on plains and in mountains. Each region has its own culture and traditions, as seen in the national costumes with their wide variety of materials, shapes and colors, in the styles of building and in the local customs. In the summer of 1991, Serbia began its attack on Croatia. The well-equipped Yugoslav army carried out Serbia's policy of territorial expansion through armed force, ethnic cleansing, and the destruction of all traces of Croatia's 1,000-year-old culture. The destruction of towns, cultural treasures and protected historical sites shocked the world and attracted great attention in the international media. But the worst war crimes took place far from reporters and news cameras. The attacks on the villages began with long-range artillery. The churches, houses and other buildings built in the traditional Croatian style were the most frequent targets. The villages were not just captured, but were destroyed, so they became uninhabitable. It was a scorched earth policy, to wipe away all evidence of the centuries of Croatian culture there. Most of the victims were the old, whose lives were bound up in their houses and their land, and who had neither the strength nor the will to flee and become refugees. The massacre of the inhabitants became a sort of ritual, which signified the complete occupation of the village. Then the plunder began of everything that could be taken. Captured Croats were taken for forced labor. The Croats who survived the first wave of violence had to wear white armbands. There were even cases where the inhabitants were forced at gunpoint into minefields. Slavonia and Baranja are well-developed agricultural areas where the people kept their traditional way of life and values, with the family at the center, and with business carried out according to strict traditional rules. The people made their own clothes from materials that they produced themselves. It's a way of life that isn't just connected with the past, but even today is a source of inspiration for the people. Nushta was a prosperous village before it became the target of artillery attacks. The local defenders managed to hold off an armoured brigade, but the village of 1,100 houses received at least 20,000 shells of all calibers. The village was built in typical Slavonian style, with the houses having characteristic facades. But the houses now fall into two categories: seriously damaged and destroyed. The village, which once had 4,000 inhabitants, is now largely in ruins. The village of Sarvash was attacked by artillery, tanks and planes. 900 Croats were driven out of the village and their houses were plundered and burnt. The tower of the late Baroque church of St. John the Baptist was destroyed by tank fire in front of Serbian television cameras. Laslovo was home for 600 people of Hungarian origin and 500 Croats. In the summer of 1991, the villagers were unable to bring in the harvest out of fear of Serbian terrorist attacks. The onslaught began with attacks on the parish church. The village was on the front line, and the inhabitants had to leave their homes. Laslovo was an example of how people of different ethnic origins, Hungarians and Croats, could live together as one people. But it was completely destroyed. After the Serbian occupation, it was plundered and burnt. The undefended people of Baranja and of the villages and towns on the right bank of the Danube had to flee their homes in the face of the Yugoslav army and Serbian forces and under the eyes of the international press. This was a fate shared by people of various ethnic origins: Croats, Hungarians, Germans, Slovaks and Ukrainians. On the 17th of November 1991, 8,000 people were deported from eastern Slavonia. The Serbian forces, backed by the Yugoslav army, destroyed the villages of Tovarnik, Šarengrad, Lovas, Tompojevci and Opatovac. They burnt all the Catholic churches and killed 400 civilians, burying them in a mass grave. The survivors fled to the town of Ilok, which was soon surrounded and cut off from the rest of Croatia. The people were faced with the choice between concentration camps and death or becoming refugees. There began the tragic forced evacuation of the town of 6,000 inhabitants. The refugees from the surrounding villages were on the move for the second time. 164,000 people lived in eastern Slavonia and Baranja before the attack started. 130,000 were forced to leave under Serbian occupation and the policy of ethnic cleansing. These people were Croats, Hungarians, Germans, Slovaks and Romanians. The Serbian forces destroyed the town of Vukovar and the surrounding villages. 5,000 people of Croatian, German and Hungarian origin were killed. Thousands more were captured, tortured and taken away to Serbian concentration camps. The village of Vocin in western Slavonia was occupied by Serbian forces. The attacks turned houses into ruins, and all Croatian property was plundered. A destroyed house became the symbol of the suffering of the family and the whole village. When the Serbian forces had to withdraw from the village, they demolished the Croatian houses. The older people who didn't have the strength to leave their homes were maltreated. 35 were killed and their bodies mutilated. Banija is a mountainous region in the southeast part of central Croatia. It was subject to the full force of the Serbian aggression, and the people were faced with suffering and mindless destruction. The Yugoslav army and Serbian militias plundered and destroyed the property and homes of the Croats. 40 villages were razed to the ground, and another 31 are almost empty. All Catholic sacred buildings were blown up. Thousands and thousands of people became the victims of ethnic cleansing. In the village of Skela, Serbian militias burned each house to the ground, and the fate of the Croatian inhabitants is still not yet known. During the attack on Petrinja, the village of Hrastovica was completely burned down, and its 600 inhabitants were forced to flee. The Yugoslav army controlled most of the roads in Banija, spreading fear among the people and making it impossible for the local Croatians to organize their defense. After the occupation of most of Banija, the Serbian forces turned to destroying Croatian villages along the river Kupa. Their artillery and tank shells were targeted on exclusively civilian buildings, family houses. The village houses, built in the traditional rural style of Western Croatia, made of oak and with outside stairways and galleries, were an easy target for the Serbian forces. The old village church of St. Barbara, with its carved ornaments and fine paintings, was destroyed by tank fire. In Banja, 1,700 Croats were killed, many the victims of mutilation. Several hundred more are missing. In inland Dalmatia, people have raised sheep and goats since prehistoric times, and this way of life is reflected in the traditional clothes and customs, elements of which, such as the red cap, date back to before the influence of the Roman Empire. In spring 1991, the Yugoslav army protected the local Serbs as they forced the Croats from their homes. Hundreds of people had to leave, and their homes and property were destroyed. The village of Kijevo, with 1,600 inhabitants, was completely surrounded by the Serbian forces, backed by the Yugoslav army. No supplies were allowed through to the village, and every day more and more people fled to safer areas. The attack took place with the help of artillery and tank fire. Every house was plundered and burnt, and the livestock was slaughtered. The only way to survive was to leave, and before leaving, the Croats had to sign that they were voluntarily giving up their property. But some were rounded up and sent to concentration camps, where they were used as hostages in dealings with the Croatian authorities. There were 3,886 Croats living in the area, of which 3,650 were forced to leave. Near Zadar, the village of Shkarbunje was surrounded and attacked. The Serbian forces burnt the village and massacred the inhabitants. Konavle, the region inland from Dubrovnik, was attacked and occupied by the Yugoslav army and Montenegrin troops. "33 villages of about 10,000 inhabitants were left in ruins. The siege of Dubrovnik, the occupation of the villages in Konavle, and the plunder of Mali Ston, Cavtat and Slano showed that this was a war of expansion and a clash of two cultures. The concepts of family and home are closely linked. The home is where family mementos and possessions are kept and becomes a symbol of family continuity over the generations. But today the inhabitants have become displaced persons. Their houses have been burned and their possessions plundered. The vineyards and olive groves have been destroyed and the livestock stolen or killed. 3,200 houses were destroyed in the Dubrovnik region, which once again in its history finds itself at the border between two worlds, its cultural heritage facing a hostile and destructive force. The region that was recently so full of life has become a shadow of itself, a place of sad memories. At the end of 1991, Croatia and the Yugoslav army signed a ceasefire brokered by the United Nations, and the Yugoslav army agreed to withdraw from Croatian territory. The army withdrew, leaving behind a trail of destruction. The number of Croatian refugees and displaced persons has climbed to about 300,000, and the number of dead and missing to 50,000. The final number of missing persons will probably never be known, for in many areas whole families disappeared, leaving nobody to look for them. The Yugoslav army withdrew its weaponry to Bosnia-Herzegovina, where it prepared for a new Serbian onslaught. Part of the weaponry was left with the Serbian forces within Croatia, allowing them to continue their attacks. The Bosnian Serbs, equipped with heavy long-range artillery, went on the offensive and occupied two-thirds of Bosnia-Herzegovina. Most of the territory was taken by force, and the amount of territory is in inverse proportion to the number of ethnic Serbs in the Republic. The war crimes and destruction took place under the eyes of the international media. The Serbian onslaught forced 1,300,000 Croats and Muslims, or a quarter of the population, to become refugees. Their houses were burned, their villages destroyed, their towns bombarded, and families were separated. It's estimated that about 135,000 people were killed in the Serbian onslaught. About 350,000 refugees from Bosnia-Herzegovina were given refuge in Croatia, despite the sacrifices this demands from the Croatian people, who were already looking after their own refugees. The United Nations undertook peacekeeping operations on the occupied territories with the aim of enabling the return of Croatian refugees to these areas. However, the situation has remained unchanged, and no refugee has managed to return. The international organizations have been unable to do anything to protect the old and the infirm who stayed in their homes. The peacekeeping forces have been unable to stop the abuse of human rights in the territories under their supervision. The international community, which espouses the principle of preserving cultural values and cultural differences, stood by while Croatia's cultural heritage was being destroyed. Since the start of the UN operation, more than 3,000 Croats have been forced from their homes in the protected areas, and about 500 have been killed, and these numbers are increasing by the day. Since the start of the Serbian onslaught, 200,000 Croatian homes have been destroyed, and this does not include the number in the protected areas under Serbian occupation, where there is uncertain data. So many thousands of people have been left without their homes and families. Their inheritance, their graveyards and their churches have been destroyed. Their world has fallen apart. The help of the international community is needed, not just to rebuild the homes and restore the cultural treasures, but also to bring back life to the areas destroyed by the war. Until then, the only power that can bring the refugees back so they can start to rebuild their homes and their lives lies in their pride, their love, and their belief in their tradition.